This podcast is brought to you by ADT. ADT can design and install a smart home just for you, and it's backed by 24/7 protection.
Like Doorman Service, which is an ADT automation that unlocks the door for packages, friends, or your kids.
Just visit ADT.com/smart to learn more about how ADT can design and install a secure, smart home just for you. Little Passports is the perfect holiday gift for that curious kid on your list. Brian, I love this service because with a subscription to Little Passports, kids get a fun-filled package every month designed to inspire their curiosity in geography, which we all need to be better at, I think, world cultures, or science. And it's great for kids of all ages. In fact, do you think they'd send a Little Passports subscription to a 61-year-old?
I don't know. Maybe they will. Order today for holiday delivery at littlepassports.com/Katie. That's littlepassports.com/KATIE.
Hi, Brian.
Hi, Katie.
I cannot believe, Brian, this year is coming to an end. In some ways, it seemed as if it would never be over, like a bad movie, if you know what I'm saying. In other ways, time flies when you're having fun. And Brian, the older you get, the faster time flies, it seems.
Well, you're younger than springtime, Katie.
Younger than springtime, are you? Gayer than laughter, are you?
I promise we didn't plan this. Anyway, as the year comes to a close, we're going to look back at the biggest names, the biggest moments, and the biggest trends of 2018. But there's too much to cram into one episode. So we're doing this in two parts, splitting up the year into five different themes.
On today's episode, we're starting by tackling the year in pop culture. We'll be chatting with Jia Tolentino of The New Yorker and Ira Madison of the podcast Keep It.
Then we'll talk about LGBTQ issues with Dan Savage of the Savage Lovecast, among many other things, and Sarah McBride from the Human Rights Campaign.
And finally, we'll get to talk about race with Jamelle Bouie from Slate and Maria Hinojosa from Latino USA.
Next week, we're going to look back at the year in climate change, and who better to do that with than Al Gore. And we're also going to have a chance to talk news and politics with Michael Barbaro from the Daily Podcast from the New York Times.
We can't wait, but let's start with pop culture, which we all know, Brian, is your bread and butter.
Oh, for sure. I love Regis Philbin, Frank Sinatra, the hottest names of 2018.
He really is on top of things, everyone. But as we mentioned, we're talking to two cultural critics for this conversation. Jia Tolentino writes for The New Yorker. You might have read her masterpiece article on millennials earlier this year, or maybe her piece about Juul, not the singer, the electronic cigarette. I like her because she's a UVA alum. Wahoo wah, everybody.
Gia is definitely my favorite UVA alum. I'm kidding, Katie. And then Ira Madison is here. He's the host of Crooked Media's pop culture podcast, which is called Keep It. He's also a writer on a new Netflix teen sci-fi dramedy called Daybreak, which is debuting next year.
And no relation to Billy, apparently. So when Ira and Jia come into the studio, I swear to God, we hadn't been talking for 3 minutes when the biggest name of the year came up. Ariana Grande, of course. Were you expecting me to say someone else, Brian?
Yeah, I don't know. I was expecting you to say somebody whose name rhymes with drum. I don't know, just me.
Or Mitch McConnell or somebody in your book. Well, that's where we started with Gia and Ira, and they went crazy, by the way. And then we got to some other big names, big moments, and big trends in pop culture from 2018. Listen, I know you've been following Ariana Grande very religiously on her Instagram feed. I've seen a lot of your likes on mine.
I'm a big Ariana fan, yeah.
I want to say for the record that she's always been funnier than Pete.
Really?
Always. Oh, yeah. Look on her Instagram. She did this fake wildlife video in Australia when she was on tour, pitch perfect Australian accent. She's good.
I haven't seen Prince on a few days, mate. You know what that means? Might be over for young Prince. You might be dead as mate.
Let's talk about her a little bit more, and we're going to talk about other big names that we really witnessed in the pop culture landscape this year. Gosh, it's funny. People kind of come and go, don't they? But she's still white hot right now. So let's talk about Ariana. Why does she have such a hold on people at this moment in time?
She's funny.
She's
like
real
Jia
funny.
said, I thought the donut licking incident was funny too.
She's been a hero
to be
since she was
honest.
slammed.
You
a couple
do
of years
really?
ago.
Because to me, that was so embarrassing. But you guys think that brought her a lot of street cred?
I think as embarrassing young people ourselves, probably we identified strongly with what it would be like to be drunk in a donut shop, try to eat a donut and say, I hate America at that particular stressful point in time. I've been a fan of Ariana since the first album, Yours Truly. The thing about her is that she's been just her star's been slowly rising. She was pitched at the beginning as, sort of like baby Mariah Carey, which didn't really do her any favors.
Right, they even had her do like a cover of Emotions. Show. She has vocals.
Right.
Yeah, she's not
she's
just
so
a pop
talented.
person.
Incredibly talented.
Is she so little? How can that big voice come out of somebody so little?
Well, she, the first couple albums, it was very retro. She kind of seemed like a songbird. She didn't enunciate very clearly
At all.
One of my old colleagues at Gawker wrote a post that was like, "Girl, Ariana, what are you even talking about, girl?" But on Sweetener, I love the album.
I think it's great too, and I love that she worked with Pharrell Williams and Max Martin, sort of like a throwback to the pop people that Gia and I probably grew up with.
What up with this whole thing with Pete Davidson? Help me understand this.
So they got engaged after 3 months or something, and I think one of the
I thought
reasons,
it was more like 3 weeks
or something like that. And the reason why I think one of the reasons that it grabbed people's attention was that Ariana has had a wild year. She had the Manchester bombing, and Pete Davidson has also had quite a life. His dad died in 9/11, and it's sort of this ultra millennial bonding based on trauma and sort of the perceived imminent end of the world, which is the thing hovering over all of pop culture in 2018. And also, they're both really funny, and they both knew how to talk about their relationship in a way that was more candid than you normally get out of people.
It was destined to fail, but it seems like it was.
I was rooting for him.
It was accelerated by the death of her former boyfriend.
Yeah, that was really sad.
Can you explain that to our listeners?
Well, her former boyfriend was Mac Miller, who was a rapper that I really enjoyed,
and also someone that steadily got better and better and better. I didn't always like him, but by the end, it was really
his
legit.
last album was fantastic. He's a person who struggled with addiction issues over the years, and once this relapse happened, I think that was just one more trauma tossed into Ariana's life.
The opioid crisis has come to music. Really, Tom Petty, Prince, Mac Miller, and Lil Peep all died from fentanyl overdoses. That's a lot.
Okay, we're going to take a bit of a turn, and we're going to talk about somebody else with a lot going on in 2018, Kylie Jenner, who was, among other things, on the cover of Forbes for being
Self-made.
potentially, quote, self-made youngest billionaire. So is she self-made?
Not by my definition.
She scratched that lotto ticket.
Yeah. I think coming from incredible family wealth does not negate being hardworking and having a extremely sharp instinct, as all those women do, for how you can monetize identity and beauty and female personhood in this age. I think people often mistake I worked hard for I'm self-made, and to me, those are quite different.
Especially since her brand is just sort of herself. It seems like, all of this came from her person.
Right.
But it's like,
and that's true.
it is true, but you also wouldn't put a Rockefeller on Forbes and say that they're self-made.
Let's talk about some other bold-faced names that got a lot of attention this year. Donald Glover. Childish Gambino. That he, to me, had such a breakthrough moment. He was obviously making a lot of noise. People were noticing Atlanta, but this brought him to a new level, didn't it, Ira?
Yeah, there was Atlanta, it was the This Is America. I've listened to his music before, and, a lot of it was sort of SoundCloudy.
Yeah. He's also getting better.
Yeah, he's That's the theme with a lot of artists this year. Actually, I feel like they've been getting better. This was, just sort of him dipping into soul music a bit more. And it just really came out in a time when, people were willing to talk about politics and music and
race.
Race. But also the video is just so vivid and grim, and I don't personally love the video.
I don't like it when stuff is, everyone is hungry for stuff that's of the moment, but it's so on the nose.
Having said that, it did make such a huge impression.
Absolutely.
It was everywhere. You couldn't avoid it. Why did that catch such fire at that moment in time, in your view, Ira?
It's made for people to talk about it. It's him shooting other black people in the video.
It's him wearing Confederate-style trousers, right? And some of the symbolism. I think people enjoy when they have to kind of peel away some of these things that are not necessarily overt or too obvious.
Yeah.
And I think people had fun kind of looking for the hidden meaning. Some not hidden, obviously. Yeah. But, the horse, the person on the horse riding by and all those other things.
It's the reason why Drake songs are so popular too, you have to capitalize on the fact that there is so much content now. And if you make a song, if you make a music video that people can dissect online, it's going to help your song be better and sort of wade through. And, with such a violent video like that, and then you put some imagery in there, people were going to be talking about it.
Another performance that really captured people's imaginations this year was Beyonce's at Coachella.
Ooh.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
How much time do we have?
Yeah, why was that so meaningful?
Let's take an hour.
Well, I'm from Texas. I'm from Houston. First time I saw Destiny's Child was at the rodeo in 7th grade. So, I've been there from the beginning.
I saw them at the Milwaukee Summer Fest.
Hell yeah.
It was great.
Hell yeah.
I was at Beachella, and it was... I'm feeling it now,
I
could
cry.
about it.
She's the first black woman to ever headline Coachella. That's wild. How did it take so long?
It's also weird because, I was never a big Coachella person before. Yeah. And,
that's why.
Well, yeah. And looking back
Coachella's the whitest place.
I know, right?
Yeah.
It was always just the whitest place.
Yeah,
but
so
then,
white,
I feel like when Kanye performed a few years ago, they started shifting more towards hip hop acts and things and less white people playing music in the desert.
So one of the reasons it was so extraordinary was that Beyonce didn't do it on Coachella's terms, right? She did it all on her terms. She was sort of performing musicology in real time. One of the things that's extraordinary about her is that the way, she was really dismissed early in her career as just kind of producing generic pop stuff. But here you see in a set like this, she is reinterpreting all of these old songs in the language of a New Orleans second line, in the language of Houston, Texas, chopped and screwed dirty rap. It's she is making this long line of tradition that she has been working within come alive. And she did it so beautifully.
It seems to me that she and Jay-Z have really mastered the art of being famous. She's the only person who could take over Vogue magazine and have full editorial control. Yeah. Do you see any danger in her power?
Well, I don't think any celebrity should be able to get editorial control over a magazine, but it does seem to be the way that we're headed.
Yeah. Oprah's interview with Michelle Obama, and Elle, it seems like we're
seeing
geared towards celebrities interviewing each other.
And there was one of the worst ones was Emma Stone and Jennifer Lawrence. They were just oh my God, you're so pretty.
It was
you are. Yeah. And it was actually, this is why Friends.
Well,
just like the old Interview magazine model. Do you remember Andy Warhol's magazine?
An Interview has a place, right? Because they would do it at a certain angle, right? They would match people up in a ways that sometimes, those conversations would be interesting.
But isn't it important to have editorial control and an editorial voice so that celebrities don't take over the world?
Yeah. I thought a good version of that was Timothée Chalamet being interviewed by Harry Styles.
Sure, yeah. It's a little bit at an angle.
It was they're both in a certain space in pop culture, and we benefited from hearing them talk to each other.
Another person who seemed to have a huge year was Tiffany Haddish.
Oh, yeah. God bless.
I love Tiffany.
I love her too.
She ready.
She's amazing.
Yeah.
Why do you think that she burst onto the scene in such a huge way?
Comedy was sort of needing a voice like hers. Some people have tried to lodge a complaint, that like, oh, she's almost the same in every movie, but that's what people want.
We've let people do that before, and it can work if we like them. Yeah.
The entire Hollywood studio system was built on exactly what you're going to get from a Gene Kelly movie.
We've gone from big names, and now we want to just talk about some big moments of the year. One was Oprah and her Time's Up, Me Too speech at the Golden Globes.
So I want all the girls watching here and now to know that a new day is on the horizon. And when that new day finally dawns, it will be because of a lot of magnificent women, many of whom are right here in this room tonight, and some pretty phenomenal men.
Was that as significant as people are making it out to be?
I don't know. I mean, I'd almost forgotten she gave that speech until now. I think that it didn't have that much impact within the overall Me Too movement.
You don't think a new day is on the horizon?
For my money, I hate award shows. I don't watch them. For my money, the most impactful moment at an award show was Frances McDormand introducing the world to the concept of the inclusion rider.
Which nobody uses.
Which people are starting to use, though.
They are?
Yeah. Michael B. Jordan's company uses it. Women are writing clauses about nudity in their contracts.
That's true.
There is that structural sort of legal protection is ramping up, and that to me means a lot more than whatever rhetoric someone says at a speech, at an award show that'll get reaggregated everywhere for 3 days and then everyone will forget about it, honestly.
You've written so much, Gia, about Me Too and Time's Up, and now Time's Up has a new CEO, Lisa Borders, who came from the WNBA. A lot of people in art business and media have lost their jobs and been banished. And I'm curious, have you seen the movement go from activism to activation? Because I keep waiting for concrete things that are happening in sort of a bunch of arenas, and I don't really see it.
I do think that, for me, always the question about Me Too, which is, again, started by Tarana Burke a long time before this last year. There's been so much conversation about what's going to happen to these men. There's been so much focus about these men's
attempts
to make a comeback and their feelings over the past year. And to me, it obscures the fact that, women couldn't get credit cards on their own until the 70s, right? We are still a long way away from change that will feel satisfying. We are still in the cycle of backlash. The Kavanaugh confirmation was, I think, partly a response to Me Too. The fact that Republican support for him went up during the hearing means a lot. And so from the beginning, I've just tried, as a young person who always expected that I would be equal and has over the last few years been realizing that a lot of the country doesn't, want things to be that way.
I know. Isn't that a sad revelation?
It is a sad revelation.
I've experienced that myself.
But I feel lucky to be young enough that I grew up expecting it, which is not the case for a lot of older generations. And I've just tried to remember that change is going to be slow. It's always been slow. It's always been uneven.
And you have to keep your foot on the gas.
You got to keep your foot on the gas. And to me, what matters, the things that the media ends up talking about with Me Too is not, again, where the change happens. The change happens in different language and contracts, and the change happens in HR meetings, and the change happens in hiring.
Well, isn't it progress that a lot of bad actors have gotten fired, and the message has sort of gone out that this behavior is unacceptable and you will be fired?
But I think we're seeing the backlash. And again, what happens to people who have done things that are wrong is not that important to me. What's important is the structures that are in place to make things more equal within the institution that those people got kicked out of, right?
Particularly because, there's so many people like a Louis C.K. or something get to come back because, one, they're successful and, they're within still this echo chamber of a fan base who will support them no matter what they do. And, a lot of people in the industry talk about how much time do we have to wait for this person to be out of the spotlight before they come back. And I think as long as people keep focusing on that instead of changing things, Hollywood it's really just sort of an ebb and flow right now. I don't think anything really structural is happening aside from the way that we're talking about.
But we're still talking about it, and that's a good thing.
So let's talk about Kanye in the Oval Office with President Trump.
People expect that if you're black, you have to be Democrat. I've had conversations that basically said that welfare is the reason why a lot of black people end up being Democrat. They say,
That
first
was
of all,
a big moment. What did you make of it?
I've been of the opinion very strongly ever since social media happened, is that, I think we'd all be better off if we made celebrity opinions matter much less. It's interesting. It's like this year has been just like it's the revision of the Kanye Taylor VMAs feud where Taylor finally spoke up about politics, urged people to vote, urged them to vote for a Democrat. But then Kanye ended up in the White House talking, wearing a MAGA hat. And to me, it was like, maybe we shouldn't look to celebrities for our
It's also the fun hypocrisy of it too, because, it's the conservatives and the right are often talking about how they don't want celebrities chiming in on politics, but it's usually just when celebrities are telling people to vote for Democrats. As soon as a celebrity hops over and wants to, wear a MAGA hat, then we should be listening to that celebrity's opinion.
But now he's disavowed Donald Trump.
Yeah, because he was in a manic episode, and then, it's really regretful. Kanye has fallen off harder than any. Kanye is one of the best producers, like one of the most influential musicians of this era. And this new album that he put out is awful. And his work got bad and everything else got bad at the same time. And to me, when he went to the White House, it didn't mean anything because, again, I try not to think that it means hanging on to every single word that Kanye said about politics at any point is never going to be particularly helpful to the discourse or anything.
If you've been a fan of Kanye, you know that he has never really been great on issues of politics, on even misogyny towards black women in his music and things. And it's just sort of, once he came to this place, it was sort of expected. It's sort of exactly what 2018 promised us with celebrities. There's a direct line between Beyonce taking control of Vogue and Kanye sort of putting himself out there in front of everyone, because I think that he was, trying to manically control his own image and, fix the fact that, creatively, he was a bit in a slump.
There is a direct line also to Kim Kardashian, got Alice Johnson released from prison, right? And it's like all of this is happening on an individual charisma, celebrity-based situation where this is not helpful. We should be speaking broadly about what needs to happen with criminal justice reform instead of Kim Kardashian marching in and getting clemency for one person. It's just such a distraction from the actual basis of change.
But having said that, I think that certainly so many celebrities have felt compelled in this Trump, environment we're living in to speak out on female empowerment, to speak out about gun violence. And in a way, I think they've been a very powerful force to spur and motivate and galvanize a whole segment of the population to get more involved in these issues.
And we saw in the election results, the gun lobby isn't nearly as powerful a factor as it used to be in elections. Maybe all the voices speaking out on that issue had some effect.
So is it positive in some ways?
Sure, yeah.
I think it's positive if you're using your voice to talk about voting and, gun control and people who are talking about voter suppression and things like that. But I think, as Jia said, a spectacle of I'm showing up to the White House and getting one thing done isn't really helpful to anybody. And it really just creates a lot of noise and people arguing back and forth.
And as you know, you can live by the tweet and die by the tweet, as Roseanne Barr tragically showed us in 2018.
Was that a tragedy?
I think it was tragic that she felt the way she felt, that she said the things she said.
Also, that it occupied so much space in the news cycle, right?
Yeah.
I agree with
Ira. We
Ira.
talked about that for months.
And it's why? It's one person's horrible. Even the fact, it's good that Roseanne got called out on what she said, but even that swallowed so much air.
I think people need to make sure before they press send that they really consider what they're saying or what they're doing. Case in point, Megyn Kelly.
There was a controversy on The Real Housewives of New York with Luann, as she dressed as Diana Ross, and she made her skin look darker than it really is, and people said that was racist. And I don't know, I thought, who doesn't love Diana Ross? She wants to look like Diana Ross for one day. I don't know how that got racist on Halloween. It's not like she's walking around
I have
general.
not seen it, but it sounds a little racist.
Now, it wasn't on social media, but social media was what drummed up the opposition to end her talk show.
Which is funny, because she had said that when she was on Fox, nothing would have happened.
Yeah, she said that. I mean, it seems like...
That's the irony of Megyn Kelly?
Yeah.
Yeah, she'd said way more racist stuff than that.
Yeah, Sarah's right.
For years.
The problem was that she
talking
tried
about victims of police violence.
Yeah.
Well, when John Oliver did that mashup of all the things that she had said on Fox before her show even debuted, I thought, wow, you do have to wonder, did NBC look at her work before hiring her?
They wanted her to be a provocateur.
Mm-hmm.
They wanted, and she is. But the thing is,
how can you be a provocateur at 9 o'clock in the morning? You do not want a provocateur in morning television. Trust me, I know this.
her energy, which was useful on Fox News, and she was the reasonable one, relative to Fox News. And her energy is that of a prosecutor. Like she's not a good listener.
That hour was successful before she joined Oprah. And it was just sort of weird to think that people...
And it was two African-American hosts, by the way.
Tamron Hall,
who were both paid less combined than herself.
Well, everybody on that show
I think
paid less.
They hired her for just this wild contract that
it was just
I think it's because she was on the cover of Vanity Fair and she was the new shiny object it girl.
Yeah.
True, but I think it was always weird to think that, viewers of that morning show were ever going to go for her brand of Fox. Otherwise they would be watching Fox.
Well, we can't talk about big moments of the year without talking about the royal wedding, which on one level...
I don't know. I just got 4 eye rolls.
Yeah, but I'm going to defend the royal wedding for a second. On one level, it was a traditional royal wedding. On another level, it was revolutionary because you had a divorced Black American actress being warmly embraced and accepted by the most traditional hidebound institution perhaps in the world outside of maybe the Saudis.
Has he melted any skepticism?
Well, Philip's sister was a Nazi. I mean, there is Nazism.
Philip had a number of relatives.
Are you saying there was already diversity in the royal family?
Right. I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, sure. It's like Meghan Markle, I think she's immensely adorable and charismatic.
I loved her on Suits. I watched it.
Yeah, you did watch it. I personally can't get behind something like a royal wedding ever being anything like revolutionary because of how I feel about institutions and weddings. But Meghan Markle is incredibly charming. And, I hope that whatever member of the family that wore that, Sambo brooch to,
that was bad. But I think the royal family reflects the culture. They're not going to lead the culture. And it says something very good about the culture that this is where they felt they had to be when Harry decided to marry her.
And let's face it, my favorite moment was when the choir sang Stand By Me and they just did not know what to do.
Yeah.
I mean, I thought the wedding was beautiful. I love a wedding. I enjoy the fact that it was a somewhat nice fairy tale story for us to talk about in the news this year.
They've got great chemistry, I'll say. I appreciate that.
But, there's still Nazis connected to the family.
And she'll never be able to go outside with bare legs, no pantyhose, or skirt above the knee again. It's a mixed bag.
I don't know
becoming
that it's
a princess.
quite that bad.
It
but
is
yes.
actually. Yeah.
She can't ever wear.
She's got to wear pantyhose. She can't wear skirts above the knee.
I wouldn't marry him for that reason alone.
You know what I mean? She's actually making a. I mean, it's a sacrifice.
Haunted by the ghosts of colonialism.
But listen, maybe she will be able to usher in more change.
I agree. Yeah, and she's been a little.
She's spoken out
about certain things. It's great.
And so. Yay, Meghan. Let's give her some time.
The Queen of England loves her, and I love that.
I like that photo of them laughing together. I thought that was really cute. All right, we've got to go over some big themes of 2018. One big theme is diversity in movies. We had Crazy Rich Asians, which I hated personally. I thought it was so dumb. We have Black Panther, which
I can't believe that was this year. It feels like it was.
I know. Isn't that crazy? Love, Simon, Call Me by Your Name. So, do you think that we're starting to open up in terms of our expectations in movies, and how did you feel about all those kind of steps?
Seeing the change toward diversity is feeling less like people really feeling like we need to include more voices and more like, how can we
make money at the box office?
How can we make money at the box office, but also turn existing things that we already do into moneymakers? It's
well, this
weird
was a real myth buster, though, because there was this idea for a long time. Oh, a black person can't lead a movie. An Asian person can't headline a movie. You know, there was a sort of an economic excuse that people made, which turns out is totally false.
And thank God that this year busted that open. I will say, I mean, one thing, like I didn't love Crazy Rich Asians either, but, you know, like one of the things we need, you know, every film doesn't have to be Moonlight, like a genius masterpiece. Like we need to there's so many like, you know, kind of run-of-the-mill rom-coms. We need to let some of them not have only white people in it, or, you know, and it's...
I love that Crazy Rich Asians got to just be like a goofy rom-com, but also there should be many of them so that everyone's not hanging their hopes on this movie being a success.
Right.
So another theme this year is reboots. What's old is new again. Will and Grace, Murphy Brown, A Star is Born.
She is going,
Sabrina the Teenage Witch is coming back.
How can we monetize this IP forever?
Well, it is kind of, does it speak to the lack of new original ideas that we have to keep going back to the well?
Oh, well, I think part of it, you know, movies have to do well internationally now to to turn a profit.
And that's why there's so many action movies with little dialogue, right?
And, you know, it's literally like, how can we maximize the money we have off of our IP by rebooting everything? Like,
The Lion King's coming back.
Well, that I'm excited about.
Yeah, me too.
I mean, Beyonce.
Yeah, I mean, the cast is incredible. But, you know, I think like the era of like the all-female reboot is pretty tired to me. I was pretty tired from the beginning.
Well, how do you feel about Murphy Brown coming back? Snore?
I didn't watch it.
Hey, I was on it. Watch it.
Oh, really?
I did a guest shot. I was brilliant.
We'll watch yours.
I was brilliant. Please check me out. But
Star
you
is
know,
Born was good though.
Yeah. Now, I guess it depends on the product, right?
You know, I mean, with all of these things, right? You can reinvent something for the sake of market performance. You can have a craven, but ultimately, you know, like well-intentioned, you know, rationale. Or you can have the like kind of dutiful, we should be woke now, we should be diverse. Both of those things are not, they ring a little more hollow to an audience than the real reason for reinventing someone, which is like the Bradley Cooper reason for reinventing Star is Born. Because like, let's do it again for a deep story and character-based reason.
Let's talk about Anthony Bourdain and Kate Spade. It seems to me this was a year where people, because of these tragedies, people were starting to talk about mental health, mental illness, and suicide, and people were starting to be a little more forthcoming and honest about their own emotional demons. Do you agree?
I do. You know, I think that sad as those events were, they got a lot of people talking about how we view celebrity culture and how, you know, social media has sort of put people's emotions bare. And it's, you know, you're still sort of seeing how a celebrity can have what you think is a perfect life that they're showing you out there. But seeing so much stuff just everywhere it depresses people. I think that has gotten a lot of people online talking about mental health and how social media affects us. And I think, you know, the Bourdain situation and Kate Spade then also got us talking, you know, about suicide as well.
Yeah, I think what I always wish for, you know, people will post the suicide hotline after these things. And what I want is for that organization to be better funded. You know, I mean, because like at some point, openness is only as helpful as the resources that are available to people when they're in crisis. And we are seeing that get chipped away at, it, you know, in budgets and, you know, like the general sort of state of healthcare and how hard it is to get for so many people. You know, because talking about it is one thing, getting the help that people need, and that often isn't enough to save people, but we need people to all have access to it. And that's what I hope is the next
It's been interesting for me to see people like Michael Phelps get involved with these online therapy apps. And it feels like people are much more open to saying, you know, I'm kind of fucked up. We also ironically have this epidemic of loneliness, despite the fact that we're more connected and on our phones more than ever before. I don't think it's ironic.
I mean, this is what social media does. It promises connection, but it only induces alienation. And
I like that. I'm going to use that as my quote card on Monday.
I think
on Instagram.
But I mean,
that is ironic.
Yeah, but it's not ironic. It's not like a strange coincidence. It's because these platforms are not honest about what they do yet.
Well,
Okay.
before we go, let's talk about 2019 and your predictions for the new year. What do you think we're going to be talking about?
We'll be talking about the election, definitely.
Do you think we'll be talking about Time's Up Me Too continuing to make progress or kind of fading out?
Oh, yeah. I mean, there are too many people that are invested in this changing. But I do think that the backlash against, this year of listening to women, literally just a year, I think it may intensify. And I think there's a lot that might get worse. This time, though, it makes it really hard. I don't know if you guys have found it, but it makes it really hard to see into the future. Like, the future just seems very, every week
Scary.
is just so unpredictable and jarring and often, deeply traumatizing that, when you can expect X number of shootings within the next month, I think it's very hard to even imagine what a year from now will look like. Like, I'm glad, but I am already glad for whatever albums, and movies,
Good
get us
escapist
through.
fund.
Yeah.
But you're right, in the face of gun violence and climate change, some of this seems a little
Well,
silly.
and I interview teenagers a lot for my job because and I think it's a really interesting time to be a young person and a really hard one because they're like, how are we going to grow up in this? And I don't know.
Well, hopefully there'll be some positive developments
Yeah, I hope
in
so.
2019 in sort of all aspects of our lives.
Yeah.
That we can celebrate a year from now.
Yeah,
I hope so,
hopefully.
too.
Hopefully. Well, Jia and Ira, thank you guys so much for coming in. It was really fun to talk to you.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
It's time for a quick break, and coming up, we're going to be talking about the biggest names, moments, and trends in LGBTQ issues this year. And then later in the show, we're going to be talking about race. We'll be right back.
Brian, how did you sleep last night?
Well, Katie, I slept very well because the sheets I was sleeping on were very, very comfortable.
Were they from Boll and Branch, perchance?
How did you guess? They were from Boll and Branch because everything they make, from bedding to blankets, is made from pure 100% organic cotton, which starts out super soft and it gets even softer over time.
Plus, my favorite part. By the way, do you think our listeners might be gathering that I'm a little on the cheap side?
Flinty, frugal.
You can buy directly from them, so you're essentially paying wholesale prices.
No wonder they have thousands of 5-star reviews, and Forbes, The Wall Street Journal, and Fast Company are all talking about them.
Try them for 30 nights. If you don't love them, you can send them back and get a refund. Shipping is even free, but I doubt you'll want to send them back.
To get you started, right now our listeners get $50 off your first set of sheets at bollandbranch.com, promo code Katie. Go to bollandbranch.com for $50 off your first set of sheets.
That's Boll, B-O-L-L, not B-O-W-L, B-O-L-L, and branch.com, promo code Katie. bollandbranch.com, promo code Katie.
Now let's get back to the show.
In 2018, we saw huge milestones for the LGBTQ community, but we also saw an administration that was hostile in many ways to that community and wanted to roll back rights and protections. Honestly, Brian, I would say it was a decidedly mixed bag.
Well, I agree with you on that, Katie. Here to talk to us about what happened on this front in 2018 are Dan Savage and Sarah McBride. Dan has been a guest on this show before, and a terrific one, I might add. He's the host of Savage Lovecast and writes a weekly internationally syndicated column called Savage Love. He's also been an advocate for the gay community for a very long time, including when he started the amazing It Gets Better campaign back in 2010.
I love Dan. I also love Sarah McBride. She's just 28 years old, and she's had an incredible life. She came out as transgender when she was at American University, where she was the student body president. She then went on to become an advocate for her community and was the first trans person to speak at a national convention when she spoke at the DNC in Philadelphia. Now she's the national press secretary for the Human Rights Campaign and the author of a really moving memoir called Tomorrow Will Be Different. Sarah and Dan, super jazzed to have you both on the podcast, and we have a lot to cover about 2018 and what it meant for LGBTQ people. Let's start by talking about some of the biggest names that surfaced in 2018. Let me start with you, Sarah. Beth Ford, why was she so significant?
Well, Beth Ford was the first openly gay woman to run a Fortune 500 company, which was a huge advancement for LGBTQ representation in major companies. Obviously, Tim Cook is an incredible, inspiring example over at Apple. And it's a reflection of the fact that LGBTQ people are increasingly rising to the top of their respective fields. And when you have openly LGBTQ people in the C-suite, openly LGBTQ people running companies, it doesn't just send a great signal to future generations of LGBTQ corporate leaders, but it also changes the corporate environment.
Not just companies, but they're now running states, specifically Jared Polis, who is the governor-elect of Colorado, Dan.
We prove that we're an inclusive state that values every contribution, regardless of someone's sexual orientation or gender identity.
I read a tweet that said the state where a baker refused to make a wedding cake for a gay couple has just elected a gay governor. What was your reaction to that election, Dan?
I was thrilled by Jared Polis's election that night. I wish it had been matched with Stacey Abrams' election in Georgia, Andrew Gillum's election in Florida. We don't want to leave Kate Brown off this list, though. She's the governor of Oregon, and she was appointed when the previous governor had to resign. But Kate Brown is bisexual and out and was elected in her own right for the first time governor of Oregon. So there were two big firsts for LGBT people in the gubernatorial front this election.
And speaking of bisexuals,
Kyrsten Sinema was elected the senator from Arizona, and she's going to be the first bisexual senator, at least openly bisexual senator.
Yeah, and she was one of the bright spots in the U.S. Senate for pro-equality candidates. She ran a really competitive, difficult race in a tough state and pulled it out. She'll join Tammy Baldwin as now the second openly LGBTQ United States Senator. She was in the U.S. House prior to. And she is a fierce and energetic public figure. So I think she's going to be a really interesting person to watch in the United States Senate.
It's a positive development that people who are open about their sexuality and about their gender identification are now being elected to office. I mean, if there's something to cheer about, this is it, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the last election, everyone talks about the blue wave and the pink wave, and those were massive waves. But there was also a rainbow wave of a record number of openly LGBTQ members of the House of Representatives come January, of LGBTQ people getting elected to state legislatures and city councils across the country. We now have added, in addition to Danica Rome, who was elected in 2017 in the Commonwealth of Virginia, we now have Virginia. We now have 3 more transgender people who've been elected, 2 in New Hampshire. They have a large state house, but they'll have 2 trans women. And then in Colorado, they'll now have an openly transgender person in their state house.
So let's talk about some of the biggest moments this year related to LGBTQ issues, not all of which are encouraging, but some of them are. One of them in the former category is the Department of Health and Human Services changing the legal definition of sex. The quote is, the agency's proposed definition would define sex as either male or female, unchangeable, and determined by the genitals that a person is born with. What's your reaction to that?
Well, this is sadly not a surprising development, and it's obviously a report that was in the New York Times just 2 weeks before the last election. But it's a reflection of individual actions this administration has taken over the last 2 years of trying to roll back our progress when it comes to the growing legal consensus that LGBTQ people are protected under federal civil rights laws. Because at the end of the day, if you're discriminating against someone because of their gender identity or their sexual orientation, you're discriminating against them because of gender stereotypes, which is illegal sex discrimination. And so just a couple weeks after taking office, the Trump-Pence administration rescinded guidance promoting the protection of transgender students under that principle. They have, in different agencies, sought to roll back similar protections. They filed briefs in front of the federal courts that assert that they don't believe federal civil rights laws protect LGBTQ workers and students and patients. So this is an incredibly dangerous action. It's not surprising that they're considering doing it more broadly. And it would have, in some cases, life and death consequences for LGBTQ people.
And let's talk about another decision the Trump administration made, which was to include same-sex partners on the 2020 census, but not to do a thorough accounting of LGBTQ people. Dan, when you saw that, did you think this is kind of a mixed bag or worse than that?
It definitely is a mixed bag, and it reinforces, a negative kind of meme or idea or concept that only same-sex, or only queer people who are married matter. Only people in same-sex relationships who have married are important or should be counted or recognized, and that's just not true. And the biggest concern that I have, even as a queer person about the census, is the question that they've added to it to ask people whether they're citizens or not, which is going to result in undercounting a great number of people who are afraid to have that question put to them because they're undocumented, or because they're undocumented people perhaps living in their house, or they've undocumented family members. And it's going to result in an undercount, and it's going to result in undercounts in places where queer people tend to live in greater numbers. And so it's going to negatively impact, how we're represented, whether we're legal or illegal immigrants ourselves or not, and there are queer, legal, and undocumented immigrants. And that's the real threat to the census, in my opinion.
What about on a state level? What happened this year, say, in Massachusetts and in North Carolina?
So Massachusetts had a really critical race for transgender people. It became the first state in the nation where trans protections, separate from protections based on sexual orientation, were on the ballot for a public vote. And let me just start by saying it's outrageous when a minority group's rights are ever on the ballot for a popular vote. It was absurd during the marriage equality referenda, and it was absurd in Massachusetts. But opponents of equality mustered up enough signatures to put protections for transgender people in public spaces on the ballot. Those are restaurants, hospitals, grocery stores, parks, public transportation, and of course, bathrooms within those spaces. We were nervous because in a lot of other places, like Houston, for instance, a couple of years ago, voters have either just barely or actually ended up rescinding protections for transgender people when they've been put on the ballot. But fortunately, Massachusetts voters came out in November on question 3 and by a 2-to-1 margin voted yes on 3 to uphold those protections, which I think was really positive nationally, because if they had won in Massachusetts, which was certainly possible, it would have emboldened their efforts in other states to try to put trans equality on the ballot. So we were really fortunate to win there. But then there were some really significant results for trans equality in other states. North Carolina is a situation where obviously Pat McCrory in 2016 lost the governor's race in large part because of HB 2, the bill that tried to ban trans people from restrooms consistent with our gender identity. The new governor signed into law a bill that took away some parts of that bill but still kept in place a ban on localities passing protections for transgender people in restrooms statewide. So there's still an issue there.
So basically saying you couldn't pass laws protecting trans people from using the bathroom that was consistent with their gender identity.
Right. They took away the affirmative mandate to discriminate, but kept in place the a ban on localities protecting LGBTQ people from discrimination, and specifically trans people in bathrooms perpetually. In Texas, though, they had a bathroom bill that didn't pass, but the 5 main sponsors ended up losing re-election this past cycle. Voters are coming forward and they're saying, this is absurd that you are trying to ban transgender people from restrooms. It's absurd you're spending your time and energy trying to do this. We'd much rather have elected officials who represent the interests of everyone and who focus on issues that matter, not some made-up bathroom predator myth.
Well, there's an interesting parallel to the marriage equality movement, where it was put onto the ballot in many states, and we lost and we lost and we lost until we won. And what you saw with the losses on marriage equality when there were votes was the needle moving closer and closer and closer, that the more we had this discussion, the more we had this debate, the more people came around and changed their positions. And on queer rights, what we often or almost invariably see is people coming around to supporting queer rights. So it's kind of this, exploding cigar that right-wing bigots keep lighting and sticking in their own mouths. Like, oh, we're going to force this onto a ballot. Oh, we're going to have a vote. And yeah, they win a few of those until they don't. It is, I agree with Sarah, 100% a debate we should not have to have. The rights of a minority should never be put onto the ballot and subject to a popular vote. Our rights are sacrosanct and should be protected. That said, this strategy of theirs has proved in the long run to be a disaster for their side.
And Dan, Sarah and I both attended the service where Matthew Shepard's remains were interred at Washington National Cathedral. And in a way, this 20-year anniversary of Matthew's horrific, brutal death was a good reminder of how gay people were treated just 20 years ago. It was profoundly moving for me personally, I think, because I've gotten to know Judy and Dennis Shepard very well over the years, and I covered that story. And I'm curious how you felt about that moment.
Well, I was, of course, tremendously moved and then tremendously heartbroken to learn, and I wasn't aware of this, that for the last 20 years, Matthew Shepard's parents had been afraid to inter him anywhere because they believed that his gravesite would attract bigots and would be defaced. And that for 20 years they felt that they couldn't lay Matthew to rest in a public space was really heartbreaking. And, as a gay guy myself who grew up in a religious family, what kind of blew my mind most about it was they found a safe space for his remains, and it was a church. Because a church was the last place I ever felt safe. Particularly when I was Matthew's age, I didn't feel safe in churches. So that was sort of a mind-blowing, unexpected development in that case, and really very healing. I have to say, though, that, this isn't just how gay people were treated 20 years ago, that there are still gay people and lesbians and bisexual people and trans people who are attacked and murdered today. Just
That's
a couple of years ago,
yeah.
A gay man was shot on the face on a street corner in Manhattan by an anti-gay bigot who had come into town specifically for that purpose to find a gay person and harm them.
What was even more moving was the first gay Episcopal bishop actually presided over the service and delivered the homily and talked very candidly about his experience. And he's so wonderful.
So I have three things I want to say to Matt. Gently rest in this place. You are safe now. Oh, yeah. And Matt, welcome home. Amen.
He is amazing. Gene Robinson is just one of the most kindest, most compassionate people
I love him.
I've ever met. And it's interesting, and I think not all surprising, that the first moments where he teared up during his remarks before his homily was when he talked about how he knows so many people in that space, so many LGBTQ people in that cathedral had been harmed and traumatized by the church, but that they were welcomed and they were home.
So he addressed what you were talking about, Dan, head on. And it was really quite remarkable to see and to hear.
At the same time as this extraordinary service happened, we've also seen over the course of 2018 a disturbing increase in hate crimes directed at LGBTQ people, as well as racial minorities and religious minorities. One instance of this that struck me was the murder of Blaze Bernstein, who was a student at Penn. He was gay and Jewish and targeted by a member of a neo-Nazi group who also happened to be a former classmate of his in Orange County. Dan, what do you attribute this increase in hate crimes to? And this is for both of you. What can we all do about it?
I attribute it to the great disinhibitor, which is Donald Trump. He has given people license to act out on their worst impulses. He's legitimized hatred in the public square, and he has brought to a boil people's worst instincts and impulses, really brought the worst out of the worst. It's incredibly distressing. And Donald Trump deserves to have the blame for the spike in hate crimes laid at his feet. And the entire Republican Party and punditry class of the Republican Party, all of them should be held accountable for what they have done to our democracy, for the poisons that they have pumped into our body politic.
Do you agree, Sarah?
Yeah, I think Dan's absolutely right. I think that what we have seen over the last 2 to 3 years is an increase almost across the board in hate-based violence and harassment. In the aftermath of the last election, the Southern Poverty Law Center found hundreds of hate-based harassment and violent incidences occurring across the country in just the weeks after. We did a survey, the Human Rights Campaign did a survey of tens of thousands of youth around the country, and they overwhelmingly reported an increase in bullying and harassment during the school day in the lead up to and in the aftermath of the last election. Every single time you see Donald Trump and Mike Pence release another anti-LGBTQ policy, there's a spike in calls to suicide hotlines. We at the Human Rights Campaign released a report documenting the last year in deaths within the transgender community. Some of those deaths are a result of explicit hate crimes. Others are very clearly a result of forces and discrimination and hatred conspiring to push people into circumstances where they're more likely to face violence. This year, at least 22 transgender people have died through fatal violence. And I think to the steps that we can take, obviously there's a number of different steps legally that we can take in terms of more states passing inclusive hate crimes laws, in terms of law enforcement making sure that they're trained and able to interact competently with LGBTQ populations, because if you don't feel comfortable contacting or engaging with law enforcement, you're less likely to be safe from violence when it comes to securing their protection.
Teachers and educators, I think, play a massive role in this.
It's about making sure our schools are more welcoming, that we are nipping this in the bud, because hate at the end of the day is learned. And if we are creating more inclusive and welcoming schools, that will go a long way.
While there have been some positive strides made and greater representation that we discussed earlier in our conversation, I also look at television and film and am heartened by the greater representation of LGBTQ people. For example, Love, Simon, about a young gay man. Queer Eye. I mean, if that's not a celebration of being gay and being human, I don't know what is.
Also, I would add to that list is Drag Race, which for 10 years has been the one place on TV where you could see working class gay guys who'd been to prison, non-native English speakers, immigrants who are gay guys, poor people who are gay guys, also gender nonconforming and trans people.
Long live RuPaul.
There's been so much. Yeah, long live RuPaul. Because, one of the criticisms that you hear of representations of queer people on television is they're all gay, white, upper middle class men. And Drag Race for 10 years has been a place where you can see the real diversity of the gay male and not just the gay male community.
And Pose, which has an incredible cast of so many trans folks of color, particularly Black transgender women, people are being educated by the shows they're watching.
For example, Boy Erased, I have yet to see that film, but it's all about conversion therapy.
Yeah.
For so long, I remember actually covering stories 20 years ago on the Today Show and people talking about conversion therapy. I think even in the case of Matthew Shepard.
It still goes on. It's still a problem.
It very much so. And one of the actual few areas of, I think, significant progress legislatively that we saw this past year was actually in more and more states passing protections for LGBTQ youth against the abusive practice known as conversion therapy.
Do we have any sense of how many people are still in conversion therapy programs?
It's difficult to say for sure, but there are some studies that have documented. A report by the UCLA Williams Institute found that roughly 700,000 LGBTQ Americans have been subjected to conversion therapy, and that currently they estimate roughly 20,000 LGBTQ youth are being subjected to conversion therapy around the country.
Unbelievable. And
I get letters at my advice column every day from queer kids who were subjected to conversion therapy recently. I've heard from people just in the last week, one kid in the last week, who's currently seeing a therapist that his parents are compelling him to see, who is attempting to do conversion therapy on him.
Sarah, looking ahead, there's some positive things we can anticipate in 2019. Same-sex marriage will be legalized in Austria, Costa Rica, and Taiwan, and it will be the 50th anniversary of Stonewall. So what are your thoughts on both of those things?
Well, I think on the first point, I think it's a reflection of the fact that equality is on the march, not just here in the United States, but around the globe, that this is a global movement, that LGBTQ people exist in every corner of this country and every part of the globe. and that we, in doing so, are opening hearts and changing minds, not just in blue states, not just in the United States of America, but in countries around the world, and that equality is inevitable with hard work. I think the second point around this is the 50th anniversary of Stonewall. It's an important point for us to sit back and reflect on our progress. Because with all of the attacks we're seeing, it's easy to get bogged down in the negativity. It's easy to lose sight of the horizon, and it's easy to forget just how far we've come. But the reality is, in 50 years ago at the Stonewall Inn, if you were to have told the folks there, the transgender women of color, the gay patrons, what would come in the next 5 decades, it would have seemed so impossible that it would have been almost incomprehensible. And the fact that we have marriage equality in every corner of this nation, the fact that we have seen the proliferation of non-discrimination protections and protections against conversion therapy in so many places across this country, the fact that a young gay kid was able to go to sleep on a Friday night in June of 2015, having just seen the symbol of our country, the White House, light up like a rainbow. The fact that I get to meet young transgender kids who are doing what seemed impossible to me just 10 years ago. They are both living their truth and dreaming big dreams all at the same time, demonstrates how far we've come, and that we have transformed impossibility into reality. And that is our challenge, to never be pacified by our progress, but to always recognize just how far we've come.
We can't be complacent, though. We used to live in a country with the Voting Rights Act, and now we don't. We secured, through the Supreme Court decision, Roe v. Wade, abortion rights as a fundamental constitutional right. That's been assailed and under attack and is pretty much non-operative or unoperative in many parts of the country. We have to defend our gains. I'm not suggesting that, Sarah, you were suggesting that we rest on our laurels, and we should take moments to marvel at how far we've come, because just recognizing the progress that you've made, it inspires you to keep pushing to make more progress. But we also constantly have to fight a rearguard action in this country to defend the rights we've won.
I also feel like the much maligned millennials are a real reason to hope. I see such a difference in attitude among people in their 20s. My daughters, who are both 22 and 27. I mean,
people in their 30s are millennials too, by the way.
Yeah, sorry. But I really do see such a sea change in attitudes, such a generational difference. And I don't know about you, Dan and Sarah, but that gives me real hope. Does it you, Dan?
It does. Sometimes I think about my own nieces and nephews. Like, we're really seeing with the millennials, the first generation of adults who grew up with openly gay, openly lesbian, bi and trans friends and family members who were incorporated and welcomed as themselves, and entirely welcomed and loved and embraced by their families and their communities. That psychs me out, gives me hope. And it's a credit to all the people who came out when it wasn't easy or possible to be out, or as out as people are able to be today. We wouldn't be here but for the queers at Stonewall who picked up the bricks and threw them.
And I think we need more people who stand up, and not just within the community, but outside the community. And I hope you know that you always have an ally in me and in Brian. So thank you both so much for coming in.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you very much, guys.
We'll take a quick break, and then we'll speak with Jamelle Bouie and Maria Hinojosa about the year in race. That's right after this. America's changing, and along with those changes, a lot of people are facing huge financial challenges, Brian.
So prudential and financial wellness expert Alexandra Drain are traveling across America to learn more about the changing financial landscape in a new project called The State of Us.
Alexandra has devoted her career to inspiring people to lead healthier, happier, and more engaged lives. And over 20 years, she's consulted with leaders and influential thinkers all across the globe.
You can join her as she partners with Prudential, and they travel across the country talking to people from the town with the longest lifespan to the town with the highest birth rate to the smallest town in America.
Today, less than half of us believe we're on track to meet our financial goals, and the State of Us is working to uncover the challenges that are getting in the way of financial wellness, and they're teaching us how to fight them.
Because while our financial challenges may feel greater than previous generations, they are not insurmountable.
So to learn more about the financial challenges facing our country, you can visit prudential.com/stateofus. That's prudential.com/stateofus. State of Us. Now back to the podcast.
For our last segment today, we're talking about what this year meant for race relations in the United States.
Joining us for this conversation, Jamelle Bouie and Maria Hinojosa. Jamelle is the chief political correspondent for Slate and a political analyst for CBS News. And he's also a UVA alum. God, it's like we stacked the deck with Wahoos today. Anyway, we know Jamelle is the real deal because he still lives in Charlottesville.
Wow, now you're my third favorite UVA alum, Katie. Again,
oh, my God.
I'm kidding. I'm sorry. We're also speaking to Maria Hinojosa, the longtime host and executive producer of the public radio show Latino USA. Maria also hosts a PBS show called Maria Hinojosa One-on-One. She's won Emmys and Peabodys for her work. She's a very distinguished journalist.
We began our conversation by talking about one of the biggest and most high-profile personalities of the year, Colin Kaepernick. Jamelle, I'm curious about what you think Colin Kaepernick did in terms of advancing African Americans and some of the issues that we're facing in terms of race this year.
Kaepernick does a fair amount of charity work, and he's been a vocal spokesperson, advocate on issues of police brutality and police violence. But I think the more significant thing about Kaepernick is not so much what he has done, and more the fact that he is the public face of this new Nike campaign. And I think it's significant because the brand, at least, believes that what Kaepernick stands for is likely to be the mainstream position, the mainstream politics at some point in the not too distant future.
Or the likely position of people who are buying Nike products, right?
Exactly.
I mean, were you surprised when that was announced, when suddenly we saw that portrait of Colin Kaepernick everywhere as the face of Nike?
I was surprised because I do think it represents something of a risk. There will be some consumers, some people who will not want to purchase Nike products now that Colin Kaepernick is the face of the brand. But it is, I think, again, it's very significant. And I think that sends a signal, or it may suggest where American culture is going and how perhaps 5 or 10 years down the road, what appears to be a divisive issue today is very likely not going to be as divisive, in part because of the demographics of the country and where those are going.
Let's talk about Serena Williams. She became a huge story when at the U.S. Open, she expressed her anger out on the tennis court.
I don't cheat. I didn't get coaching. How can you say that? You owe me an apology. You owe me an apology. I have never cheated in my life. I have a daughter and I stand what's right for her, and I've never cheated. And you owe me an apology. You will never do that.
And the intersection of sports and gender, I think, was so clear with the Serena Williams incident. And Jamelle, for you, as you watched the conversation, I remember watching that match, watching Serena, and just seeing it explode on social media. What struck you about not only what Serena did during the U.S. Open, but the reaction?
I mean, I think the reaction to Williams' actions, and specifically from her defenders, I think shows the extent to which Serena Williams has almost transcended tennis as a figure in popular culture that people, and I wasn't following it too closely, but I was following it closely enough to notice that some of the people who were vocally defending Serena Williams weren't even big tennis fans, but they were fans of her. They were fans of what she represents. And they saw this as profound disrespect to a woman who arguably is the reason anyone cares about women's tennis in the first place. There is a sense in the reaction, sort of a how dare you disrespect this person who has done a lot for the sport and who does a lot for us by virtue of what she represents and how she carries herself and who she is.
America Ferrera is another name, Maria, I think, who had really came out in a very sort of strong way about sexual harassment. She was a key figure in the Time's Up movement. She edited a book. How important was her high profile this year?
You know, America did stand out because she's kind of everywhere. She's on television. She's writing the book. We all know she had a baby. You know, we're kind of following her. But America she's been owning her voice for a while. So she was very prominent in the Hillary Clinton campaign. She was a very prominent activist for the Democratic Party and has been. And in many ways, you're right. What she did in terms of Time's Up was that she was helping to make this beyond a movement. It was like, what do we stand for? Creating a whole legal defense and education fund, kind of really trying to understand how you tackle this from a strategic and structural place as opposed to just protest. So that's kind of America thinking really strategically.
I think she also got a lot of street cred because I think for her, because she is Latino, talking about really expanding this whole movement outside of Hollywood and talking about people who are working on factory floors, who are working in homes, who are working as clerks in stores. I mean, I feel like for whatever reason that seemed to resonate in a way that didn't necessarily resonate when you looked at a white actress talking about these issues.
Right, because what she was saying is, if you think about women being sexually harassed in Hollywood, think about the women who pick the grapes or the blueberries or the raspberries that you're eating. The bigger connection for me, though, Katie, is that what America kind of symbolizes in 2018 is the many, many, many Latinas who are owning their voice and owning their power. And we've all witnessed this, right? So, for example, there's that moment in the elevator with Senator Jeff Flake.
On Monday, I stood in front of your office with Addie Barkan. I told the story of my sexual assault. I told it because I recognized in Dr. Ford's story that she's telling the truth. What you are doing is allowing someone who actually violated a woman to sit in the Supreme Court.
That was Ana Maria Archila, along with Maria. I
interviewed her after that.
Sure, we all did. We were all, like, hey, and I've actually known Ana Maria for years because she gets to that point of being able to step in that elevator because of the fact that she's been trained as an activist because she's an immigrant rights activist. So you see how people are making the connection. She's taking on the issue of sexual violence, but she was trained as an activist because she's an immigrant rights activist.
And her own story is so compelling, too. What happened to her when she was just 5 years old.
And she didn't speak about that for a long, long, long time. But like Ana Maria Archila, then you'd have to say, well, Emma Gonzalez from Parkland, who, was leading the March for Our Lives. This is another young Latina who is changing the way we're thinking about politics. And then, of course, that ends up in the midterms with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and many other Latinas who are entering Congress. Latinas were making these quote unquote intersectional connections. It's a difficult word, but we're making the connections between who we are as Americans, who we are as people engaged in American politics, in my view, as a journalist. And we're saying we have something very particular to bring and to add to the conversation.
Well, Maria, you segued us very nicely from biggest names to biggest moments. And perhaps the biggest moment of the year was the midterm election. And Jamelle, I'm curious about the role that you think race played. What's your assessment?
Yeah, I think the story of race in these elections is a little complicated, and you can think of it from several different perspectives. The first was just the fact that the president kind of wrapped up his midterm message with fear-mongering about a group of asylum seekers heading for the United States border and referring to them as sort of this rapidly approaching threat that will overwhelm American borders and destroy communities and so on and so forth. And all of this was not true, and there's quite a bit of great journalism debunking the president, essentially. But I think the effect of that messaging, which I think you could accurately describe as race baiting, ended up likely juicing enough rural turnout that the Republican Party could hold on or flip Senate seats in Florida, could win in Indiana as well, could help beat Claire McCaskill in Missouri, and essentially keep the Senate from falling out of Republican hands. Now, in the end, the Republican Party began this Congress with 52 senators. It will end this Congress with 53 senators, so or begin the next one with 53 senators. So the net effect wasn't that great, but it's still meaningful that the party was able to hold on to the Senate in the face of real Democratic energy and public discontent. So that's the first way I think race played a part in these elections. The second way is the fact that Democratic primary voters seem to have a real appetite for diverse candidates. And I think most of the narrative around this has been in terms of women broadly as a class. But if you look just a little deeper, you see it's specifically women of color. And so Ocasio-Cortez in New York, Ayanna Pressley in Massachusetts, Deb Haaland, Lauren Underwood in Illinois. And what's striking is they don't necessarily represent majority minority districts. Many of these candidates represent majority white districts. The most racially tolerant whites are becoming Democrats, and the least racially tolerant whites are becoming Republicans. And this is reshaping the electorate along lines that aren't exactly even.
It was very exciting for Latina women with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. You have Veronica Escobar, Sylvia Garcia. And by the way, a record 43 Latinos will be serving in Congress in 2019. So why such a change, do you think, this go round?
So Latinos and Latinas, it looks like they kind of got the message. I've been very concerned because, Katie, so the joke is that I'm Mexican, so I have 16 jobs. One of those 16 jobs is that I'm a professor. So I'm with young people, and I've been very concerned, feeling their kind of exasperation with the electoral politics. And so I was very concerned about what was going to happen with the midterms, because when
with turnout?
Yeah, in terms of turnout, because if you are consistently attacked, does that make you feel like, okay, let me go and vote? And I do think that one of the big stories of this moment is, and if you look at Texas as an example, the Latino-Latina turnout in Texas and the activism around, whether it was for Beto O'Rourke or for the other Latinas and Latinos who got elected from the state of Texas. Everybody had been saying, when is it going to happen when is it going to happen in terms of Latino-Latina turnout? Well, I think we're seeing it in real life.
And Jamelle, before we wrap up our discussion of the midterm elections, we also saw two huge stars in the Democratic Party, both African Americans, run and lose races for governor just by a hair. Stacey Abrams in Georgia, Andrew Gillum in Florida, allegations of voter suppression around both races. Where do you think we go from here in terms of those two individuals, as well as sort of the broader challenge of making sure that everyone who wants to vote gets their vote counted?
Well, as far as those two individuals is concerned, I think they both have very bright futures. Gillum in particular went from being the mayor of Tallahassee, which is a small thing, to being a nationally known gubernatorial candidate, and did so almost by surprise. He won his primary, striking victory from behind that no one really saw coming. And he came closest to winning a gubernatorial race as a Democrat in Florida since the 2000s. And so although he lost his race, the Florida electorate also repealed felon disenfranchisement for most felons in the state. And so that's 1.4 million additional people added to in the pool of potential voters. And you can imagine in 2022 a concerted effort to get some portion of those people registered and ready to vote for a second run from Gillum. So I don't think this is the last we've seen of him. Abrams, likewise, and I'll say, I think, Abrams ended her race with a concession speech that wasn't really a concession speech. It was a speech essentially saying that this was not a fair election, that my opponent, who served as Secretary of State for Georgia, responsible for administering elections, did everything he can, both in this election and in prior cycles, to remove people from the ballot, and specifically people who vote for Democrats. Hundreds of thousands of people were removed from the rolls over the course of just a few years, far more than you would expect given just population change. The case Abrams made to her voters and to the public at large was that something needs to be done about this, and instead of slinking into the night, I'm going to use my campaign infrastructure, I'm going to use my connections in Georgia politics, I'm going to use my past organization building to spearhead an effort to reverse these attempts to restrict access to the ballot. And so I think Abrams will very much be in not just Georgia politics, but national politics for the foreseeable or for the near future. And I think her approach to this, I think, will be replicated in other states by other Democrats.
Let's step out of politics and talk about a few other key moments that happened this year. I'm reminded of Papa John's CEO John Schnatter stepping down after using the N-word during a training call, and Megyn Kelly talking about blackface and Halloween costumes, and summarily being fired for those comments.
And yet, Jamelle, one of Donald Trump's biggest applause lines is to attack political correctness. And I saw a poll recently in which a significant number of Democrats bemoaned the rise of political correctness. Do you think that we've overreacted to some of the bad words or even bad deeds that people in public life have made? Or do you think that this whole movement is kind of an appropriate step and reaction to abuses that have gone on for far too long?
The interesting thing about that political correctness poll was that, and I think it showed something like 80% of Americans didn't like political correctness, but didn't define political correctness. And so it's this very vague definition of a somewhat vague term that has a negative connotation. But having said that, I think that behavior by individual people in society follows norms, follows elite signals, follows larger, political culture. And a political culture in which open bigotry doesn't receive any particular sanction, I think can create a situation where down the line people feel more comfortable expressing forms of bigotry. And I think, one consequence of the election of President Trump has been that in American society, that people have become more open to voicing racially biased opinions, other kinds of bigoted opinions, because, the President of the United States voices them too. And there has been an uptick in biased crimes against Jewish Americans, against Black Americans, against immigrants, against LGBT Americans. And so these things are real, right? Like it isn't the case that people are getting offended over irrelevant or trivial things.
So one of the most horrifying moments or stories this year was the forced separation of migrant kids from their parents at the border. And the deadline has now passed to reunite children with their parents, but there are still hundreds of families who have not been reunited. Maria and Jamelle, you've both reported on this story. Will the Trump administration ever successfully fix the problem that they've created here?
So this is not a problem that is only a problem to the Trump administration. In other words, what we have to recognize is that children have been being taken from their families at the border for a long time. In fact, if you kind of do a pullback, I'm just going to go really, really wide historically for you guys, because I needed to do this myself to kind of understand. And children were being taken from their parents as Africans because we were told in this country that they were property. Native children were taken away because they were seen as uneducated or savage. Children were taken from their parents when they were put into so-called internment camps. So the uptick in terms of immigration was something that, under the Trump administration has taken a different turn. So zero tolerance, created by this administration and by Jeff Sessions, was all about that, exactly, zero tolerance, and we will take your children, and that's going to be an act of punishment. I think one of the things that was really horrifying for me to hear was when I was down reporting actually about a Latino man who runs the shelters where these children are being placed. And our story on Latino USA was, the moral dilemma of Juan Sanchez. He's sheltering these children, but he's also making a profit off of doing this. And the fact that we have to recognize that there is a different way of looking at this. We're talking about family separation. That's a very scientific, clinical way to talk about children being ripped out of the arms of their parents. So I do think, though, that this moment of seeing children in cages, of hearing those cries, this is something that will not be forgotten in 2018. And I do think that we will see what happens in terms of the presidential elections. But immigration actually didn't used to be the most important issue for a lot of people. This president has actually made it one of the most important issues, and not necessarily because people want to build a wall, but because now they care about what's happening. And that That may be, as we say in Spanish, le salió el tiro por la culata, which is like it backfired on Donald Trump. People care now because he's kind of exposed how brutal it can be.
Are there still children who remain separated from their parents? Because the news cycle is so fast. I feel that story has come and gone, and people are not reminded.
There are. And what's different now is that we have 14,000 children right now being held by this government, immigrant children. Some of those children came on their own. In other words, the parents couldn't even afford to come themselves and simply said to their kids in the kind of Sophie's Choice, go and find safety. So some of those are those kids. Others are children who are still being separated. So we have more children now being held by this government who are immigrants than at any other time. And one of the reasons why they continue to be held is because when family members want to come and take the children, family members who are undocumented have been picked up by ICE. When they're trying to come and pick up these children, we have to open our eyes to how horrific this kind of the ICE industrial complex has become.
But it seems to me immigration reform is really necessary because you do kind of understand that you can't have completely porous borders, right?
It's completely necessary.
And to
the
me,
problem
it's
now
sort
is
of so crazy. Like, come up with a plan that works and some kind of process that works and some kind of humane way to treat people who are seeking asylum. I mean, it just seems like a big mess, Maria.
It does. It is a big mess. And sadly, Donald Trump, because of his rhetoric, this has really made it feel like a police state for undocumented immigrants and for many immigrants. But it didn't start with him. It was President Bill Clinton who signed these laws into effect in 1996. They were ramped up under George W. Bush. President Obama could have done immigration reform in the first 100 days when they had the House and the Senate. He chose not to. And President Barack Obama, a constitutional lawyer, was overseeing the massive deportation of more people than any other president in history. So it is a collective responsibility. It is on everyone's shoulders. But sadly, it has gotten incredibly worse under the Trump administration.
Do you think, Jamelle, in 2019 we'll see Congress try to tackle this, or will it basically never be dealt with?
I mean, I think there's certainly an appetite among Democratic lawmakers, some newly elected Democratic lawmakers, to craft a humane solution to the problem of people living in the United States who do not have documentation. And I think it's sort of important to frame that as being kind of the grand issue of immigration reform. Border crossings are at an all-time low, right? And even there hasn't even been a significant increase in asylum seekers. We have sort of procedures for asylum seekers that aren't being overwhelmed. They are orderly. The sense that the border is somehow being besieged by sort of large numbers of asylum seekers and immigrants is something President Trump likes to put forth to help his political agenda, but doesn't really reflect the truth of the situation. What we do have are 10, 11 million people in the United States who do not have documentation, who have stable lives, who have jobs, who have families, and most Americans believe that they should have some pathway to legal status and citizenship. And that is the issue. And while I think there is a consensus among Democrats about trying to create a path to citizenship for those people, there isn't a consensus among Republicans. And as long as that's the case, the only hope for getting some sort of comprehensive immigration reform is if Democrats once again hold a trifecta of the House, the Senate, and the White House.
To me, the connection has to be because I was thinking about language and hate speech and, kind of political correctness. The word illegal to refer to a human being is something that it's kind of normalized in our country. For a lot of people, myself included, that feels like hate speech. And the person who taught me never to refer to a human being as illegal was Elie Wiesel, survivor of a Holocaust. He said, never refer to a human being as illegal. That is the first thing that the Nazis did. If you're calling them illegal, then you're dehumanizing them. Then their lives don't really matter. Then they themselves are an illegal entity. Then it's okay if you're housing them like this. Then it's okay if you're taking away their children. Then it's okay if you're separating and ripping up families. I know it feels really small, But in some ways, part of what we can do to lessen the fear of this moment is, in fact, to think about the words.
So looking ahead to 2019, to wrap things up, Jamelle and Maria, what would you like to see happen? And are you optimistic any of it will?
I am incredibly optimistic right now because I feel like after these midterms, we have seen something that I feel like there's hope for American democracy. We're not going anywhere, none of us, right? And so in that sense, I'm hopeful that people feel very alive. They feel very woke, if you will, and they feel engaged. And that is something that you can't put a dollar sign on, right? That is something that we are all living and experiencing. It's been a really challenging 2018. But I think the other side of it is that people are saying, boy, we're tired, but we're not staying quiet. And that's what a democracy looks like. And that's wonderfully exciting.
What I think will be interesting will be to see how our public conversations around race and racism and bias are different when you have a new sort of generation of young leaders of color able to jump into the mix and make their voices heard. One thing that I remain astounded by is incoming Rep. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's ability to sort of command media attention. And to make her, to insert herself into the conversation, and drive it in a particular direction. And with voices like her in the mix and others, I think some of the, cultural and political flashpoints of the past 2 years will play out very differently next year, just by virtue of the fact that there are different kinds of people with different kinds of priorities and interests responding to them. So that'll be interesting to watch. I don't know how it will play out, but it'll be very interesting to watch.
And as you said, people like Stacey Abrams being out of the mix but staying in the mix, right?
Right.
Making sure that these issues don't recede, but they stay in the forefront. And I do think, I said it earlier when we had a conversation about the LGBTQ community, this younger generation is not going to tolerate a lot of things. And I think that's very heartening. They're going to keep the conversation going and keep attention on some of these issues. And they're going to be like a dog with a bone. They're not going to let it go. Jamelle and Maria, thank you all for coming to our podcast and discussing the state of race relations, as complicated and broad as that topic is. But certainly a lot has happened this year, and I think a lot of consciousness has been raised, and people are more woke than ever, as they say, and I think that's a good thing.
Me too. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
That does it for us today, Brian.
The podcast Dream Team is producer Emma Morgenstern, associate producer Nora Ritchie, and audio engineer Jared O'Connell. Special thanks to Brendan Burns at Earwolf LA for recording me, as well as Jamal Milner.
A special thanks to Beth DeMaz, my assistant, Julia Lewis, the social media prodigy, and Jen Brown, who helps us book guests here on the podcast.
Jared Arnold composed our theme music. You can find me on Twitter at GoldsmithB. And Katie continues to be an influencer of epic proportions on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, and especially Instagram as what else? Katie Couric.
Don't forget Snap. If you have thoughts about the show or questions for us, please reach out. Our email address is comments@couricpodcast.com, or you can leave us a voicemail by calling 929-224-4637. Thanks, as always, for listening. We'll talk to you next week. This podcast is happily sponsored by ADT. ADT can design and install a smart home just for you, backed by 24/7 protection, like doorman service, which is an ADT automation that unlocks the door for packages, friends, or your kids. All controlled from the ADT app or the sound of your voice, and backed by 24/7 protection. Just visit ADT.com/smart to learn more about how ADT can design and install a secure smart home just for you. Little Passports, it's the perfect holiday gift for that curious kid on your list. With a subscription to Little Passports, kids get a fun-filled package every month designed to inspire their curiosity in things like geography, world cultures, or science. Little Passports is great for kids of all ages. Order today for holiday delivery at littlepassports.com/Katie. That's littlepassports.com/Katie.
Stitcher. Just talking about that.
Are you in the Bayhive?
The Beehive.
Listen,
I was
I'm
there.
confused.
Oh, it's the Beehive, not the Bayhive.
Yeah, because it's
Sorry.
Beyonce.
Yeah, I get it. But they call her Bay, though, right?
Some people do.
Yeah, I think
Okay. The people I follow call her Bay.
You call her Bay. Kitty Couric calls her Bay.
No, but don't.
I mean, it's not like a brutal murder during the course of an armed robbery was a routine daily event in this part of the state, right? This is something that happened very, very infrequently.
Adel, Georgia, a town of roughly 5,000 people not far from the Florida state line. In 1998, there was a shocking murder there.
Police investigators quickly put a man in jail for the crime. He swore he was innocent.
Basically, they was gonna get somebody black for killing that lady.
But then, some 18 months later, a second brutal murder.
And just months after that, 2 more.
You see something savagery like that, it's like, somebody that does that is a straight psychopath.
And the chance of 2 different people doing the same kinds of things, I mean, it just seems kind of crazy, right?
I'm Jordan Smith.
And I'm Liliana Segura. We're reporters for The Intercept. Together, we have more than 30 years of experience investigating wrongful convictions.
We know how they happen, and how putting the wrong person in prison for murder means a killer goes free.
Murderville, Georgia. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen.